Okay. So good afternoon. Can I ask you for one small favor, please, to shut down your phones and all other devices that you don't need for taking notes, because I noticed that you get distracted too much with that. So please do me a favor if you can, and forego the use of your phones for a while. If you need a laptop to take notes, that's okay, but also shut down all other devices. So today we move forward with what is chapter 13 in the book, and it's macroeconomics. Macroeconomics chapter 13. So now you'll remember that at the very beginning we made one distinction during the first class session, I believe. This recording is pain in the neck always. Okay. So the distinction between macroeconomics and microeconomics. So anyone remembers how did we define micro and macroeconomics? What is the difference between them? Macro is M-A-C-R-O. Macro. What is the difference between micro? So both terms, micro and macro, are Greek. A specific meaning. Micro means something small. Macro means big, large. So usually we define microeconomics as an economic theory that analyzes what individuals, private firms, and households do in economic life, how they make their decisions about production, consumption, and exchange. That's a study of what those small units of economic analysis, firms, households, and individuals, how they behave in the economic life. Hence this prefix micro. So you'll see that most of what we do in this semester is more micro than macroeconomics. Specialization, division of labor, supply and demand, prices, equilibrium, entrepreneurship, profit, all kinds of things. All of that is essentially theory of the firm, theory of production. So all of these things are microeconomic. So microeconomics is the basic economic discipline. I would even go so far as to say that microeconomics is economics. But macroeconomics deals mostly with governmental policy, government policy. And it studies things like national income, accounting, GDP, GNP, business cycle, when a country is in a recession or not, unemployment rate, inflation rate, and so on. So it studies these big things that are happening at the level of the economy as a whole. So macroeconomics assumes that we can use the economic science to study directly what is going on in the economy as a whole, not by looking at what individuals and firms and those small discrete units of economic analysis do, but by looking directly at the data, empirical data, and understanding what the data says about the economy as a whole. So today, I'm going to try and introduce you into the basics of macroeconomic analysis. We will do a couple of things today. The first one is national accounting. National accounting. is national accounting? Is actually measuring the economic performance of a given country. How do we know that American economy is expanding or contracting? How do we know that the standard of living in this country is increasing or decreasing? How do we know by how much productivity or production increased in the last 3 months or 6 months? We just got a piece of data this morning that in the third quarter, which means from June until September, American economy expanded by 7.7%. After declining by 9% in the second quarter because of the pandemic and lockdowns and shutting down essentially large swaths of our economy, we back up again and the economy is opening up, so it's expanding. So how do we know that? And what kind of statistical measures we use to measure economic performance? So that's the first thing. And the second thing then is that how we use these measures of national accounting to make sense of the business cycle. Business cycle. Anyone knows what is business cycle? Any ideas about that? What is business cycle? Anyone heard about recessions? What is a recession? Yeah, the economy goes down. We are not trying yet to define what does it mean to say that the economy dips. We have to understand that by analyzing national accounting, what kind of measure, what kind of unit we use in order to see whether economy increased 2% or decreased 3%. But business cycle is a phenomenon that economic development of pretty much any modern country in the 19th and 20th century goes something like this. Periods of positive economic growth followed by periods of recessions. So you have two. Business cycle is a typical and expected and empirically attested succession of periods of high positive economic growth and periods of economy dipping, as we heard, recessions, negative economic growth. So now we need to, this is an extremely complicated problem to understand why is this happening, why business cycle. We will see later on in the last part of today's lecture, I'll try to say something about why is this a problem or a puzzle or something that requires a very good explanation. Because starting from a microeconomic analysis of the economic process, you wouldn't have expected the economy to go to develop in these cycles. A period of boom followed by a bust or a recession, and then once again boom. But you would have expected it to grow by like an even annual rate, similar even annual rate. And yet it doesn't. And we will see that there are different explanations for why it doesn't. But in order to make sense, first, in order to establish that the American economy is or is not in a recession, we first need to know what we are talking about, what kind of measures we use to estimate or to express economic development or progress. So business cycle is boom and bust cycle, as sometimes called. Boom and bust. Okay. So when it comes to national accounting, there are three basic concepts, 3.5, I'd say, let's say 4. Concepts or statistical measures that we want to take into account and to understand well before we try and develop a theory of business cycle. The first one, so national accounting. The first one is something called gross domestic product. or GDP. And closely related concept of gross national product, or GNP. GDP is more important, but for certain purposes, GNP is used. I'll explain in a moment what all of them mean. The second national accounting category is the unemployment rate. Unemployment. And the third one is inflation. So these three are basic statistical measures of the economic performance or economic well-being of a given country. And I'll try to explain to you today during this lecture how these measures are calculated, what they mean, and why do we need them, and what are the relationships between them. Okay. So let's start with the first one. With GDP. What is GDP? GDP simply means the total market value of all goods and services produced in a given country over a period of year, typically over a 1 year period. So the total market value of all final goods and services. I'll explain in a moment what does that mean, final goods and services. That means goods that are sold to the final consumer. So examples of that would be consumer goods, but also investment goods, stuff like machines and tools, pieces of equipment, vehicles, everything that is finished, finalized, and sold to the final consumer, final user. What GDP doesn't include. So GDP is a statistical measure. You calculate the total market value of all finished final goods and services sold to its final user. It doesn't include the so-called intermediate goods. So one example, a car that is sold to a final customer is a part of GDP. But steel that is bought, or some plastic part, component that is bought by a car company from somebody else is not part of GDP because it's not sold to the final customer. So everything that firms trade among themselves, all purchases, all expenditure between different firms, between different market agents, that doesn't involve the final user, final consumer, that's not part of GDP. We'll see in a moment why is that the case, but just for now, accept the definition that GDP involves only final goods. One more important point. GDP includes in any given country. So GDP is the market value of goods and services produced in a given country over a given period of time. That means that everybody who works and produces in this country, for example, contributes to GDP. That's why the category is called the gross domestic product. So I'm a Canadian citizen, so whatever I produce, whatever I sell in this country is a part of GDP. Every other foreigner in this country, our incomes are part of American GDP. We'll see later on how we calculate GDP, income. All goods and services that we produce or participating in producing this country are counted as a GDP. Americans who live abroad, their contribution does not count as a part of American GDP. So American nationals who live in France or Canada, wherever, their results, wherever they produce, is not counted as a part of American GDP, but as a part of the GDP of those countries abroad. What is GMP? GMP is simply all economic value produced by citizens of a given country. So that means American GMP, what the American GMP would include. It would include all economic value produced by American citizens who live in the United States, minus economic value produced by foreigners who live in the United States, but plus economic value produced by American citizens living abroad. One question for you. What do you think? What is greater at this point? If you control for education and all other factors, if you assume that that the structure and income of Americans living in the United States and those living abroad are the same, which is greater, American GDP or American GNP? What do you think? Any ideas? Why?
Taking account both the citizens in the U.S. and citizens outside the U.S. GDP is just citizens.
No. GMP includes American citizens in the United States, but excludes the foreigners who live in the United States, and then adds to that American citizens who live abroad. Why? So, louder, please. Yeah, that could be one reason. A lot more people here so producing more. What about Americans? Is it likelier that an American will earn of the same description, same education, same economic productivity? I said that we control for all the difference. We assume that Americans who live in America and abroad are exactly the same in terms of their income and in terms of their economic productivity. Who is likely to earn more, Americans who live here or those who live abroad? Here, because this is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Unless they live in Luxembourg or Norway or Switzerland or maybe, I don't know, one or two countries in the world, it's very likely that they're going to be living in a country with lower income. So the same mechanical engineer of the same level of productivity will, in all likelihood, 99% earn more in America than in any other country in the world. So then that's another reason why it is expected that American GDP is greater than American GNP. It's different for poor countries, actually. So my home country, Serbia, we have a very large immigration in countries like Germany and Switzerland and Austria, much wealthier countries than Serbia. So our GNP is vastly greater than our GDP. I'm a good example. That's my home country. I would be earning, for the same job I do here, I would be earning like 3 times less, 4 times less than here. So my income here in America counts as a part of Serbian GNP. I'm still technically a citizen of Serbia. I've been born in Serbia, so I didn't forgo my Serbian citizenship. So it counts as a part of Serbian GNP. All Serbian immigrants to Germany or France or Norway, they earn 5 to 10 times more than they would be earning in Serbia. A friend of mine is a pharmacist in Norway, and she earns like, I don't know, 10 times more in Norway than in Serbia. And people are sending then money back home to friends and relatives and family and so on. So then a country that has a greater GNP than GDP then can afford to a higher standard of living than its domestic productivity allows. If you have a more huge number of people who live abroad but maintain the connections with the friends and families home, they can then send money back home and increase the spending power, purchasing power of domestic population. So people in Serbia typically live better than you would think from the GDP figures of Serbia. Domestic economy, the value that the domestic economy can produce cannot sustain the standard of living that most people enjoy. And this difference is paid for by people like me, essentially. And those who earn much more than me. Okay, so that's one interesting piece of data. GDP versus GNP controversy. In wealthy countries, GDP would tend to be higher. In poor countries, GNP would tend to be higher. Okay, how GDP is calculated now? How we calculate this final value of all goods and services sold on the market? There are actually three ways of doing it. The first is the so-called expenditure model, expenditure method. What this method does is actually it adds up together 3 or 4 different components of economic activity. Let's say GDP, sometimes conventionally marked as Y. Don't ask me why, for some reason. Production is marked as Y. The first component is C, or consumer spending. So that totals or adds up together the total consumer spending on all goods and services, all consumer goods, consumer service, goods and services. That's the first component. Typically, this component is the largest one, like something about like 65% of total GDP goes for spending on consumer goods. That's why economists are always very on the lookout for consumer confidence. You heard it. The American economy is not doing great because there is a consumer confidence. The secret reason for this is that the consumer spending comprises almost 2/3 of total spending in the economy. 65% of all spending. Let me qualify this. Of total spending on final goods and services. 65% of total spending on final goods and services is spending on consumer goods. The second component is I. That's investment spending, which means purchases of capital equipment and machinery. Component G, that's government spending. So government spending also counts as a part, not the entire government spending, but only purchases of goods and services that the government buys, like office supplies and wages of government employees, or materials that the government uses to pave the roads or to invest, to build infrastructure and so on. All expenditure on goods and services that federal government and other governments incur are part of GDP. Redistributive programs, remember last time discussion, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, spending on that is not a part of GDP. Okay, so bear that in mind. Plus something called net exports. So what is net exports? Net export is a difference between exports and imports. So if you add up consumer spending and investment spending on domestic goods and government spending, and then you look on the trade balance, the relationship between your exports and imports. If exports exceeds imports, then your GDP will increase. Then your net exports will be positive. Export is greater than imports. If it's the other way around, your GDP will be lower. You will have to subtract the amount of trade deficit. If you import more goods than you export, then you have trade deficit, and your net export is negative. Why is that the case? Because exported goods comprise a spending on our domestically produced goods. Remember the definition at the very beginning. What is GDP? GDP is the total market value of all domestically produced goods and services, final goods and services over a certain period of time. So it doesn't matter technically whether foreigners pay for our domestic goods and services or we. So export is a part of GDP because those are domestically produced final goods and services, like soybeans or corn that we export to Chinese are part of American GDP. Chinese are buying our goods and services. And vice versa, imported goods, what is that? That's our domestic spending on foreign goods. So it's not part of our GDP, it's a part of a GDP of a country from which we import that good. Okay? Now that's the explanation why the exports is a part of GDP, imports is not. So then when you make accounting calculation, this difference is added to GDP or subtracted from it, depending which one is greater. So that's one method of calculating GDP. There is another method, which essentially boils down to the same thing. That's the so-called income method. So income expenditure method, whatever. My expenditure, if I buy something from you, if I buy a car from you for $3,000, that's my expenditure. But also it's your income. But one and the same transaction, just looked at from two different points of view. The same applies to the calculations of total social income. Total expenditure has to correspond to total income. $3,000 of total expenditure equals $3,000 of someone's income. So now how income is calculated? All sources of income that we discussed last time are added up together. So rents, interest income, profit, and wages. All these added up together comprise domestic GDP. Just looked from the point of view of recipient of expenditure. This method of calculation is when you look at things from the standpoint of a buyer. Those people who spend money. Income method looks at the same magnitude, at the same quantity, at the same phenomenon from a standpoint of the recipient of payments. What is the reason that, what do you think, that we don't include the transactions between the firms, transactions in intermediate goods into GDP? According to some calculations, 70% of total expenditure that is happening in an economy is expenditure on intermediate goods, that people are buying and selling stuff that is not the final good or final service. What do you think? Why we exclude intermediate expenditure from our calculation? Here, all these forms of spending are just spending on final goods and services. Imagine how every single product is made. Some examples in your book. So somebody cuts down the tree and then creates whatever a log that costs $50. Then he sells this for $75 to somebody else. This guy makes a board and then sells the board for $150. And then this board is made into a table, and then you sell a table for $400. And GDP would only register the final sale of a table. What's going to happen if we include in the GDP figures all the previous transactions? If we include all transactions with intermediate goods, we would be making double counting. Essentially, we would be adding to $400 of value that's finally created, $400 that are just intermediate goods. All of those transactions were already incorporated into the final price of $400. So that's the reason why intermediate goods are not included into GDP, in order to avoid the double counting of economic value. Well, it's not that we created $800 of, although when you look in the accounting books on all the firms, you find $800 of expenditure. But only $400 of real economic value is created, the final table that is being sold. Everything else is done only in order to create a table as a consumer good. So that's the reason why we then count only final sales. To customers. So there is another fine distinction here between finalized or finished goods and final goods. So what is the difference? Finished good, a car is a finished good made by the manufacturer, but it's not a final good yet. When a car becomes a final good, final consumer or investment good, not when it's done in a factory.
Is that when someone buys it?
So,
Is that when someone buys it?
yeah, when it hits the retail stage of business. So you see, physical transformation of a certain good and physical production is not the final stage of production in the economic sense. What is the final stage of a production of an automobile is a retail stage. So the good doesn't change physically at all, but just moves from one economic agent to another. So the fact that the good is finished in terms of physical production doesn't mean that it is final good yet. One more thing. How should we distinguish between investment goods and consumer goods? Is there anything objective in a product, in a good, that tells you, aha, this is a consumer good, this is a final consumer good, or no, this is investment good? Is a car investment good? Is a car purchase calculated as a part of I or as a part of C? What do you think? Why C? What if you're a cab driver and you buy a car in order to earn money? Then it's an investment, and you have to pay taxes to it, which is different. It's an investment. So it depends. The definition is not quite clear. What is an investment good and what is a consumer good depends on the final purpose that a person has.
What if you can sell the product?
If you can sell a product, we'll come to that. The short answer is that doesn't count as a part of GDP. Second-hand sales are not part of GDP. We'll see in a moment. That's one of the reasons why GDP has limitations. It doesn't measure the full economic value of production and exchange in society, because we would usually say that people are better off when they make second-hand sales. Of course. Why would they do them if they didn't expect to benefit? But GDP measures only the final sale of freshly made, new products. So, another important caveat here, only final freshly produced goods, new goods and services. Any more questions? Go ahead.
What about people that buy
You mean people, private persons who buy clothes and then they sell it illegally or privately or whatever?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's just both as if they don't have a business, if they're not a regular retail business, that's counted as a consumer purchase. Okay, now you see it. This is you try to measure how economy is doing by how much new goods and services it produces every year. GDP is expressed. What is the unit in which GDP is expressed? What do you think? What is the unit? Is it a quantity or is it a monetary unit or what? Yeah, dollars. It's a monetary unit. So market value of goods and services, it means quantities, how they calculated. How many cars were produced of a certain kind, times price per unit. You get potatoes, tomatoes, wheat, whatever. So the dollar value, GDP, is expressed in monetary units. We will see that this creates complications when we want to compare GDP in 2020 with GDP in 2004 or 1965. We have certain problems. It's not kind of apples to apples comparison when we compare that. Why is that? What do you think? Why it's not so easy to compare GDP in 2020 with GDP in 1974?
Because of inflation?
Yeah, inflation. So it's not apples to apples comparison, because if you have a high inflation rate in the meantime, you would be expressing economic value in 2020 in inflated dollars. So you would be overestimating 2020 income, 2020 GDP, if you don't correct for the inflation. We'll come back to that. We'll see how we do that. How we try to express like a GDP in constant dollars. $1960, $1970. Before that, just a few words about some limitations of GDP. So this is the idea. You want to calculate, to objectively estimate the economic productivity or economic growth. What is economic growth then? Can you define me now economic growth? If we for a moment disregard these difficulties of comparing GDP in different years, if we assume that we can compare GDP from one year to another, what is economic growth then? By using GDP as your independent variable. Define me economic growth by using GDP as an independent variable, which means constant that you use to define something else. When a country GDP goes up, economic GDP goes down, economic growth negative. Okay. So that's actually what we do. That's how economists define economic growth, economic recessions. What is, I'll give you now a definition of a recession. 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth, which means GDP declines for 2 consecutive quarters, which means for 6 months. If GDP declines for 6 months, that means country is technically in a recession. Okay, what are the limitations of this? The first limitation is something that we touched upon already. That is that it doesn't take into account second-hand deals, second-hand trades. If you sell me a second-hand car, this doesn't register in GDP figures, but we are better off. You earned new income. I got a new car, a second-hand, but a car that I like, but this doesn't register in GDP. So this is one of the reasons why GDP figures tend to underestimate the real economic welfare of a country, because they don't, GDP figures do not include the benefits of second-hand trades, second-hand deals. The second limitation of GDP is that it doesn't include or doesn't account for the effects of black market deals. Like the example we've heard about, somebody buys a large amount of clothing and then sells to somebody else illegally without privately. Or somebody buys cigarettes. There used to be a smuggling of cigarettes from one state in the United States with lower taxes to another with higher taxes. So you buy in New Jersey or wherever, and then you sell in New York where taxes are much higher. So regular cigarette prices much higher. You illegally sell at lower prices. So those kinds of transactions, smuggling and black market transactions, are not accounted for, are not included in GDP. So they also tend the fact that GDP doesn't measure or doesn't express black market activities also contributes to the underestimate of the true economic well-being. People benefit from buying cigarettes at lower prices from bootleggers, from smugglers. Larger is the size of the black market, of the informal illegal market, greater the underestimate of the economic welfare. So typically GDP underestimation of economic welfare is far lower in the United States than in Serbia, because a smaller part of total American economy is in the black market. In every country, even the best run countries in the world, like in New Zealand or Norway or Switzerland, some part of the economy is in the black market, because there are incentives for people to try and bypass them. So more corrupt, paradoxically, more corrupt and less well-governed a country is, GDP is a less precise measure of its economic welfare, because the larger part of the economy then is in the black market. So in 1990s, when I was very young in Serbia, I think 70 or 80% of our economy was on the black market. So you would be buying not only clothing, gasoline, you would be buying cooking oil, bread, milk, fertilizer for agriculture on the black market. Like a 70 to 80% of all deals or all trades or all income would be on the black market. And vice versa, in Luxembourg or Switzerland, almost everything is in regular channels. So these two factors, second-hand deals are not accounted for, black market is not accounted for. Both of these factors tend to underestimate the absence of these factors in the GDP figures leads to underestimation of the economic welfare. Another thing is that the non-paid labor is not accounted for. So that, what does that mean? That means that people who perform services for other people that are not paid in family or otherwise, they contribute to economic well-being, but they're not registered in the GDP figures. If you employ a babysitter and pay her a regular wage for that, that's counted in GDP. Services, wages are paid. But if your grandma takes care of your children, that's the same service, but which is not included in GDP as well. So all non-paid services are producing economic welfare, but are not counted as a part of GDP. One more thing, accounting categories do not correspond to the real economic categories. In one case, we have the overestimation of the economic welfare by GDP figures. That's when it comes to profit. Profit is a source of income some people have. The accounting profit is almost always greater than the economic profit. So GDP calculates the accounting profit, but the real economic profit takes into account not only the statistical or accounting profit, but also the opportunity cost, remember. So you earn $20,000 by running your company, but then you forgo $15,000 of wages that you could have earned had you not run your own company but worked elsewhere. So your accounting profit that GDP statistics captures is $20,000. But the real economic value that you have that you wouldn't have had otherwise, and then society wouldn't have had otherwise, is much smaller than that. So to that regard, GDP then overestimates economic welfare because it doesn't take into account and cannot take into account opportunity cost of investment. Because nobody knows, even the decision maker cannot be sure. But we can assume that opportunity costs are real and positive. So that's the opposite. The first three limitations were related to the underestimation of that underestimated the economic welfare. There's presence of the opportunity cost or economic profit overestimates GDP. And finally, the fifth one, which also tend to underestimate how much better off we are, is the change in quality of the products. So even when we control for inflation, the only thing that we can do when we compare GDP in 2020 with 1995 is to compare quantitatively. So 200 cars times price of a car. If we assume even that the prices are the same, is really, that's my rule of thumb is that Honda Civic in 2020 is a better car than any car that existed in 1995. How do you account for the fact that cars are way better, of higher quality, even if they're of the same price that they used to be 20 years ago? You cannot account for that. Computers, laptop computers, 2020 and 2008. They're not comparable at all. You're very young now, but I remember the first laptop that I had in 2005, I believe. Oh boy, that's a different world. That's a different product than this thing that I have right now. So does this inflate or deflates, increases or overestimates or underestimates GDP figures? What do you think, this fact of that quality of products increases? Does GDP, by not taking account of quality changes, because it cannot take account of quality changes, does GDP overestimate or underestimate the real economic benefits that we have, real economic welfare over time? It's simple, it's not a trick question. It's just probably the first thing that pops up in your mind. Underestimates. It says laptop, 200 laptops times $350 a piece. But the laptop in 2020 is a much better product than in 2005. So this is another source of, another bias in GDP accounting, that it underestimates the value on account of typically higher quality of newer products. Okay, any questions for GDP? Okay, let's move to unemployment. That's another category. So what is unemployment? That's a percentage of people who are actively seeking job but cannot find a job. Percentage of what? Of total population? No. Percentage of something called total non-institutional population. So you can write down that phrase, total non-institutional population. So what is the total non-institutional population? So that's everybody older than 16 and younger than 65 who is not currently hospitalized or imprisoned, who has a legal right to work. Everybody between 16 and 65. Why 65? Yeah, retirement age. So total non-institutionalized population is everybody between 16 and 65 who is available for work, who has a right to work, and who can perform work. So people who are in hospitals, people who are in prison, they are not obviously part. They belong to, it's an adult population minus people who cannot work and belong to the adult population. So what is employment rate? Employment rate is a number of people who work full-time divided by total non-institutional population. So let's say if you have 1,000 people, let's say a small country, 1,000 people, satisfying the description between 16 and 65 and non-institutionalized, and you have 950 people who are employed. So your employment rate would be like, what, 95%?
Why full-time? Why full-time?
Oh, that's a definition. There is no particular reason for that. That's simply, it's a convention that we count the full-time employment as a criterion of being employed. So employment rate is 50. Here would be 55%. What would be the unemployment rate, do you think? It's not the first thing that you might think by looking at the numbers. Probably the first thing that you, what is the most natural assumption here? Why 200? You have 1,000 people total and 950 who are employed. So 50 over 1,000. Well, that's not correct. That's not correct. Why that is not correct? The criterion for somebody to be defined statistically as an unemployed person, it's not enough that you are non-employed. You have to be actively seeking job. You need to actually actively seek job as expressed in, to apply for job opportunities, to be on the labor market. So the unemployment, the number of people who are defined as unemployed statistically is lower than the difference between total institutional population and total employment. Why? Because not everybody who is not employed actively seeks job. Stay-home moms, people who are between, who are changing careers, who decided not to apply for a job for a long period of time. They're outside of the labor market. So people who are not employed comprise, this category comprises of two different subcategories. The unemployed, those are people who actively seek jobs but cannot find it, and people who are out of the labor market. Sometimes they're called discouraged workers, because one of the reasons why people may be outside of the labor market is that they simply looked for a job for a certain period of time, they couldn't find it, they got discouraged and they dropped out. They stopped looking for a job. Or it could be the other way around. It could be that a family has a high income and then they decided that husband or a wife, they're going to drop out and go to school for 2 years in order to qualify for a better wage later on. It might be a sign of economic prosperity. You cannot say from first principles which one it is. So another category here to bear in mind, labor market participation rate. So the unemployment rate is the number of people who actively seek job and cannot find job divided by total institutional population. Labor market participation rate is employed people plus unemployed. Employed people plus people who actively seek job, divided by total population. So here, let's say that 20 people are actively seeking job, 950 are employed, and 30 people are out of the labor market. So then your labor market participation rate would be 97%, 970. So 20 unemployed people plus 950 employed people. It's typically assumed that higher labor market participation rate is a sign of economic health. It's usually assumed that if labor market participation rate goes down, that means that people are dropping out from the labor market, that some people who would be hopeful of finding a job and applying actively for a job now are discouraged and drop out of the labor market. That happened, by the way, in this country after 2009. That labor market participation rate dropped significantly. And the main reason for that was that there were fewer job opportunities at that time, 2009, 2010, 11, 12, 13. It started inching up only after 2014, 2015. So the categories to bear in mind here, the unemployment rate, it's typically assumed that lower the unemployment rate, the better. How unemployment is calculated, household surveys, weekly surveys that people ask. A representative sample of households. Do you work within the last week or two? Did you apply for a job? And so on. And then they calculate the percentages. So you don't count literally every single household, but you create statistically a representative sample like a 10,000 representative household, similar to what we see in opinion polls. So these are not perfect methods, but they are good enough to catch the trend. You don't count literally every single voter in North Dakota in order to see who is going to win, Joe Biden or Donald Trump. You select maybe 200 or 300 people according to certain criteria whom you consider to be representative voters, and then ask them what they intend to do. So something similar is applied here. So there are two categories here, frictional unemployment and real unemployment. So what is the optimal, even if the economy is working very well, you wouldn't have 0% unemployment. Why? Because some people will be changing jobs all the time. If you quit the job in Microsoft and accept 2 months later a job at Google, in the meantime you would count as an unemployed person. Does that mean that your unemployment is a particular sign of a problem in the economy? No. Actually, people change jobs all the time, so somebody will be unemployed at any one given point in time. So some level 1-2% of people would be unemployed technically all the time. But that's not a problem in and of itself. The problem is when you have much higher rate of unemployment. That happens in a recession. So you know that then when the pandemic hit and when the lockdowns were imposed in this country in the spring, the unemployment rate increased dramatically. So this is called cyclical unemployment. Unemployment having to do with the business cycle or with the recession. So cyclical unemployment is the real problem. It is one of the signs, one of the measures of economic condition of the country. Typically, a country in a recession will have a much higher unemployment rate. Any questions? Inflation. So what is inflation? It's an increase in the price level, or the decrease in the purchasing power of monetary unit. Or that means that for $1 you can buy less goods and services. If you have inflation, you can buy less for $1. How inflation is calculated? Typically, it's calculated by creating the main index of inflation is something called CPI, or Consumer Price Index. To make a long story short, what is this? Is that you select a basket of representative goods that every single household is buying, comprising the energy costs, clothing, food, drinks, and so on, basic stuff, basic consumer goods that every family is buying. And you add them up, and you calculate the price of the total consumer basket. And then you compare what happens, how much people need to buy next year or next month or in 2 years and 3 years and so on. So you set them, let's say that is $3,546 is the value of consumer basket. So whatever, 5 loaves of bread, 6 pounds of meat, you add up everything and calculate the value. So this is the value of consumer basket. If you want to start comparisons of inflation with 1960s, you select those goods in 1960. And then you set up this consumer price index at 100, CPI, in the beginning, in the first year, with which you want to make comparison. It's set as 100. 3,546 is set as 100. So then let's say that 20 years later, the value of the same basket of consumer goods is $4,000. Then you calculate how much in percentage terms you divide this with that. Actually, this with that. And you see by which percentage this value of consumer basket increased. And then your CPI will be whatever, let's say 126. Then your inflation rate is 26%. If the value of representative basket increases 26%, your inflation rate is 26%. If you compare 2 years, let's say 2018, well, let's say 1960 in America is 1960 seconds, and 2020. Now we're going back to GDP. How can you use the inflation rate in order to adjust GDP? So what is it? There are 2 categories of GDP. So nominal GDP is a nominal dollar value of all final goods and services in dollar units of that particular year. which is not corrected for inflation. So that's nominal GDP. What is real GDP? Real GDP is a value of goods and services in 1 year converted into the prices of some previous benchmark year. So in our particular case, that would be the value of all goods and services in 2020 expressed in 1960s prices. So let's say that consumer price index was 100. And that the value of the same consumer goods in 2020 was 256. Then you would have 156% increase in inflation rate. So this figure here is called GDP deflator. So how you calculate real GDP? You take the nominal GDP in 2020 and divide it up by GDP deflator, divided by GDP deflator. So you reduce it and multiply by 100. So GDP deflator is a measure, is a category that you use to reduce, to deflate the current nominal GDP into real GDP. So real GDP is GDP in constant $1960 in the prices of 1960. So real GDP is the category that is used routinely to detect the business cycle and recession. So it doesn't matter what happens with nominal magnitudes, we use the same. The American government uses the prices of 1960s to correct nominal GDP figures. So when real GDP goes down for 2 consecutive quarters, we say the economy is in a recession. So you divide nominal GDP by GDP deflator, you get real GDP. Now, of course, what if the price level drops, let's say, between 1960 and 2020, that the price level, consumer price index is lower now. It's the same basket of consumer goods that was worth $100 in 1960, now is worth 96. You had negative inflation, 4%. So you then divide nominal GDP in 2020 by $0.96. So you get a bigger number then. And it's GDP inflator. If you have a negative inflation rate, then your real GDP will be higher than your nominal GDP. If you have a positive rate of inflation, your real GDP will be lower than nominal GDP. So we typically assume that inflation in the 20th century, this accounting was invented in the 20th century, inflation rate was always positive. So economists always assume that real GDP in any given year will be lower than nominal GDP. Because the initial reference year will have a lower price level no matter what. Prices go up every single year, so this adjustment will always reduce your real GDP rather than increasing. But in the 19th century, it was the other way around. In the 19th century, we had secular decline in the price level. So American wages in nominal terms increased much less in the 19th century than in the 20th century. The amount of money, the number of dollars that you get. But their purchasing power was increasing dramatically. Why? Because the price level was going down. So it doesn't matter whether your wages are stable, stagnant, and the price level goes down. You're better off just as if the prices were stable and your wages increased in nominal terms. It's irrelevant. What is relevant is purchasing power. If you had the same $100, but the price level goes 5% down, you're better off 5%. You can buy 5% more goods and services for the same amount of money. That's the same as if the price level remains the same, but your wage increases 5% in nominal terms. From an economic point of view, there is no difference between these two at all. Okay, we are almost out of time. Any final questions about any of this? Okay, see you then. Have a nice weekend. See you next week. Tomorrow I'll post the homework assignment tomorrow.